do today is I won't take up the whole hour. I'll probably talk for about 25 minutes or so. I just want to share with you all a project I've been working on around game-based learning in law. And in particular, kind of given the theme of the EduExe kind of festival, some of the links between game-based learning and inclusivity in the classroom. That's what I'm going to be talking to you about, basing on my own experiences of developing a real game that does exist called Judge with an exclamation mark. You won't be able to see this. This is just proof that you can see the game is real. You'll see some examples in the slides to come. So here we go. So the starting point really is just I want to explain a little bit what I mean by game-based learning, because there's within the literature on all of this, there's quite a lot of disagreement and different kind of uses of these two terms, gamification on the one hand, or game-based learning on the other hand. And some people use these as synonyms. You know, that is something that people do. But certainly it's my view that the more you look into this, of course, I'm a law person, I'm not necessarily an educational psychologist. The more you look into this, there is a meaningful difference between game-based learning on the one hand and gamification on the other. And that is that certainly kind of based on my understanding of this, I see gamification as something which is more extrinsic in that it's not necessarily linked directly to a learning task. It's often used in terms of motivation or engagement, rather than being part and parcel of a specific learning activity. So a classic example in that sense of gamification would be giving people badges or awards or something like that for progressing through a Moodle page. You know, you've got to week 10, a balloon pops up on your screen saying, well done. That's quite fun, potentially a little bit gimmicky, but really it's about kind of using those gaming mechanics to motivate people or to reward people for reaching a certain stage in a course, for example. And that's all very well and good, but game-based learning, as I understand it, is somewhat different, and I think of it differently. There is this wider area of study, the serious games discipline, which is a real big discipline in its own right. And borrowing from that idea of serious games, game-based learning is about a focus on learning and using games and gaming mechanics to deliver learning outcomes. So rather than having your experience as a student gamified through leaderboards or things like that, actually there is an activity within the classroom using a game, using gaming ideas that is there to deliver learning outcomes of a session. And so in that sense, there is some extrinsic kind of motivation there, but also it's intrinsically relevant to what you are doing. And so this is really the starting point that I came into this from. And just in terms of how that idea of game-based learning might relate further to inclusivity, there's a number of different ways in which games can become more inclusive in contrast to perhaps a more traditional approach to a classroom. So in my discipline, which is law, very often we have the classic lecture seminar split. You have a lecture, that's your large group teaching. That can be quite interactive, of course, but primarily it's transmissive. And here's the stuff you need to know, the basics. And then we have the interactive seminar workshop model following that. So typically I would give a lecture. Next week, there'll be a 2-hour seminar. There'll be work prepared in advance. We'll discuss it as a group. And that's kind of the traditional way of doing it. Now, one of the kind of problems that I'm sure academic colleagues in the room will appreciate is that you can often get quite limited discussion in seminars. Sometimes that's because the students aren't prepared. Sometimes that's because they're just following along but don't want to contribute. And sometimes that would be because actually the learning and teaching methods you're using aren't really meeting the needs of the students within that moment. Law as well is a very high pressure subject, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the kind of students it attracts. They're often students who do put themselves under a great deal of pressure because they see themselves in a race with others to meet these very competitive elite law firms. Now, that may not be the right way to go about their legal study, but you do have that kind of sense, that fear almost in the classroom sometimes. So the reason that gaming comes into this is that it can provide an alternative to that traditional method of teaching, which, despite our best efforts, is often quite didactic. So the starting point here is that play is fun, right? If we're playing a game, we are not doing a kind of test-based academic exercise where if you get the law wrong, you might look silly in front of your friends or your enemies, indeed. You know, it's something that is fun and is trying to make you rethink that classroom experience, not as a kind of test to be endured, but actually an environment where we can play and fail in a very safe way. You know, if we're playing a round of Monopoly with our friends and we lose, whatever, you know, it's different to being told, no, no, you're totally wrong, and that's not how the law works. So that's the starting point. You see this in a lot of the writing and research in this area. The fun elements of play leads to inclusivity by kind of softening the classroom atmosphere and reducing some of those barriers to participation that you may get from students. And as well as that, you're using different methods, different techniques when you're playing a game. And that's my second point here. There is a contrast to that traditional learning style, which might be, you might think of it as a kind of, you know, chalk and talk, sage on the stage kind of approach, or, you know, group work and feeding back, that other kind of method that's often used. What you've got when you play games is you are creating and fostering a collaborative enterprise. People are playing together, learning the rules of the game together, experimenting with that together. And you can also, I don't do this with my game, but you can, of course, have a number of games which are played by individuals. And so you can make it a more individualized gaming process. And you can tailor the gaming methods to ILPs and different individual learning styles as you need to. So, for instance, the game that I've been working on for the past few years is very visual. And so that kind of helps students who learn in that more visual way, or who may find it helpful to have visual representations of legal concepts that they can move around and play with and shuffle with. And similarly, students in terms of language processing, there's quite a lot here in terms of symbols and concepts, where you're taking them away from, in law, a very heavily written word focused subject, and actually to provide students with the ability not to have to read a 50-page judgment written in quite complex language, and to actually think about the law in a different perspective. And kind of through this again, you can use gaming then to promote deeper learning, because students are engaging in quite a safe way with the rules of the game and thinking about how the concepts we play with within the game relate to their legal study. And it means they don't have to get bogged down in those technicalities as much as they might do in other forms of teaching. And as I'll kind of talk about in a minute in terms of the game I'm creating, when you then have the space, that safe space to discuss law as a game and in terms of the rules of a particular game, you can relate that as in the teaching environment back to a substantive topic, a substantive discussion. And so the game I've created is about legal reasoning, which is the process of putting together legal arguments. It's a threshold concept, a very important part of legal learning. By playing a game that demonstrates how judgments are put together, you can then say, okay, well, look, in this little game, what's happened is this person's judgment has a few elements to it that's got more points than this person's judgment. Why is that? What's the deciding factor? That this person's judgment has an authority from a higher court. Let's talk, therefore, about why higher courts, the judgments of higher courts, have more legal value perhaps than others. How do we fit that into the court's hierarchy? So that kind of method of taking the game back to the substantive topic at hand. And just a few other points on here that I just want to quickly flag is that something that often comes up in the serious games literature is the sense of flow. That idea that when you're engaged deeply in a task, such as playing a game, your motivation can kind of descend into a sense of flow of really deep engagement with the topic at hand. Another advantage of games in terms of inclusivity is quite often you're not introducing new ideas. What I mean by that is many students will be familiar with games, right? Whether that is board games, or whether that's playing on their Xbox, which I suddenly sound very old, don't I? Those playing on their Xboxes. I naturally do have an Xbox. I realize that came across as quite an old man thing to say. Um, but by using mechanics and ideas people are familiar with, perhaps from the previous kind of 18 years or so of their lives, it can create a sense of the familiar. Now, there are drawbacks to that, of course. Not everybody will have had access to games, or not everybody will be a gamer, but many people will be familiar with some of those basic kind of gaming mechanics. I have colleagues at other institutions who use off-the-shelf games directly, and modify previously commercially existing games for use in the classroom, for example. There is one kind of drawback, well, there's a few, but something just to flag up. If you're thinking about using games in the classroom, you need to ensure, of course, the game is physically accessible. That might be in terms of ensuring you can actually provide a copy of the game that you're planning to use, but also just thinking about ways in which the students can actually access and use the game, whether that is an accessibility point in terms of tactility and in terms of the ability of students to actually use the gaming materials, or if that's kind of accessibility in terms of the language that's being used or the concepts being taught. So that's just something, of course, you always need to have in the back of your mind. But really, it's these kinds of elements of game-based learning that I feel are particularly relevant to that theme of inclusivity and the way in which we might learn more inclusively in class. So I'm now going to spend a bit of time telling you in more detail about this game that I have created. I should say co-created, because it is a co-creation with my colleague Tom Giddens, who's a professor of jurisprudence, which is kind of legal theory and stuff, up in Dundee now. And I've actually been working on this with Tom for about 5 years as this project has developed over time. So we got together at a conference. Tom and I are friends, and we used to have board game nights together quite a lot before we moved to other ends of the country. And one of the things that we started to think about at conferences as well was the power of games in law and how we could use games to teach the law. And so we started here with the core foundational kind of topic in legal study, which is legal reasoning. So legal reasoning, for those of you who are not familiar, and I'm going to assume none of you are familiar with this, is the way in which we analyze and use legal authorities in a way that is accepted by the courts, and in a way that is used by solicitors, by barristers, by all kinds of legal practitioners to advise their clients. Truth in law is a bit of a funny thing. It's not like a mathematical truth. Quite often you're dealing with concepts that mean something very different legally to how they do in everyday usage. And the system by which you evaluate truthfulness of a particular legal term requires you to look at how that term or concept is used, not just in doctrinally in an act of parliament, for example, but how it's interpreted and applied by the courts. And that carries with it a whole bunch of other considerations, including which court, how important was this point to the judgment, how accurate is it based on the reading of previous cases. So it's a really complicated kind of thing. And yet it is one of the first things that we have to teach in any legal degree, because it's that core threshold concept. How do courts reason? How does the law work? And so the idea was to try and find a game-based way of delivering some of those ideas, because it's a topic that, despite its fundamentalness to law, is one that students often struggle with. They often struggle with it because by the volume of kind of reading that needs to be done for this, but also it's often counterintuitive. It's often, you might get the highest court saying one thing, but the court below it saying another. Well, how on earth has that been the case? How have you managed to get two courts disagreeing in this way or on the same point of law? And it's something that often students do struggle with because there's so much to it, and we throw it at them at the very start. And so we've created this game, and it's about creating that more inclusive, engaged, deep learning environment. Now, I have written an article about this, about the design of the game that goes into much more depth about game-based learning principles, which was published a few years ago now in the Law Teacher, which is the International Journal of Legal Education. You can access that. We definitely do have a subscription to it. And note at the time, the title of that piece is at the top bullet point there. It's called Ratio, a Game of Judgment. Since then, we have actually changed the name of the game to Judge, just to make it more obvious. Ratio is a reference to a very particular term in legal reasoning itself. The ratio of the case is the core legal principle forward from that case. So that's what that's about. So then, how do we play this game? How does it work? So, students are given cards. And you play this in groups really of between 2 and 5 students. And it's really simple in terms of its core dynamic. Students take it in turns to pick cards up from a central pile and put them into their hands. That's what they are doing. And the aim of the game is to pick up cards from your hand and then in front of you, place down the cards which together form a legal judgment by placing cards which represent the key elements of legal reasoning. And those are an authority, so that means a case or a statute, an act of parliament, an argument, so kind of the process of forming that authority into an argument you would put before the courts. And finally, what's called the application of the law to the facts. So in any kind of legal reasoning, we're saying, this is the authority or authorities that we are relying upon. These are the arguments we are making, and this is exactly how that relates to the legal dispute before the court. So we've kind of distilled legal reasoning into those 3 main blocks. And so what happens is when you put down the cards, each card has a particular value. Once all the cards are gone, the game is over, the round ends. This normally takes no more really than 5 minutes. And everybody will have in front of them a series of cards representing elements of a judgment. And you can add value to your judgments by drawing on cards that reflect other legal principles. I've given some there, but overruling, for example, we're saying a judgment has more points and is therefore is more complex and therefore is worth more points if it contains within it the skill of overruling, where a higher court has said, right, this previous decision, we disagree with it. This is why we disagree with it. It's being overruled. Well, you might do this by saying that a card has breached the principles of a fair trial. This is where it starts to get a bit top trumps, where you start to say to your, you might have this breach of fair trial card in your hand, and you can say, right, my friend over there, / my enemy, your judgment is breaching the principles of a fair trial. This removes all the points from it. And this is a kind of a very powerful card, but the idea is to encourage people to think about the value of a fair trial and a fair hearing and how we should secure that. Or you might formulate a principle. There's other things you can do, but this is something else that more complex judgments do. A particularly kind of important judgment by a high court won't just resolve the dispute between the parties, it will actually set out a broader principle through which the law can develop further. So that's just some kind of the basic idea here, but you are just picking up cards and putting them down to try to create these legally valid judgments. So let me give you a demonstration of what that looks like. So this is an example of a valid judgment. You might have the following cards in your hand and you've put them down in front of you. You have a statute, that's the yellow one. So we've color-coded things as well to try to make this kind of clearer to students which element of legal reasoning is being satisfied by which card. So we might say, in this example, you've got a statutory authority, there's an act of parliament. Let's say that's the Human Rights Act. Then there is an argument card. And so again, this is just demonstrating that the Human Rights Act is being argued to apply in a particular way. And then your application, which is your actual way in which it would help your clients. So you can see here that we've kept this quite abstract, and that comes back to that initial point about inclusivity. We've not jumped in with complex legal ideas and the ins and outs of what, say, the Human Rights Act means. We're looking at the conceptual level. How is argument happening? And we can take this example and we can then talk students through it in terms of what it would look like in practice and refer them then to real cases rather than throw them in cold to read what's often quite complicated judgments. One other thing you can see on this screen over to my left, and probably your left as well, because this is not a mirror, is the fact pile. So the pile of fact cards, this is something I've not yet spoken to you all about. This is just a reflection that all cases take place within a factual matrix. So this is just, again, something we're looking for in those judgments. You want to put down a fact just to reflect the reality that without facts, there is no law. So I'm going to give you an example, perhaps I'm definitely going to give you an example here of what a judgment might look like by the end of a proper, kind of quite complicated judgment. You can see there's quite a lot coming in here. I want to talk through with you how this relates to legal learning. And again, just to reiterate that idea of we're trying to create a more inclusive atmosphere with a safe way to play with the concepts of law in a way that is not about getting the answer right or wrong. You know, it's about what the cards have dealt, and we would use this as a discussion point to see how this relates to reality. I've already introduced the idea of a statute to you all, but I just want to show you a few other cards here and how that relates to legal reasoning. On the left here, you can say something called a leading case. And this reflects the idea that there are some authorities in law which are more settled than others and which are more likely to be cited successfully than others. There are cases on topics in law that are considered the leading cases, the key case that demonstrates everything you need to know about that subject. And this being the law, some of those are from 1890, you know, or earlier. So the idea here is that in this judgment, the argument has a leading case, not just any old case, but a particularly valuable case, as well as an Act of Parliament. So perhaps the case is explaining how the Act of Parliament should be interpreted, and another case kind of confirming that to be so. All of that is in the judgment together. So if we're going through this with students, we'd be saying, right, okay, why do you think that a leading case is more valuable in terms of the points? You can't see that, but it is, than a mere normal court case. And what makes it a leading case? So it's an insight, an inroad into that kind of discussion, which is incredibly important to lawyers. Something else here is there's a card here that says settled argument. And again, this is the concept that not everything is up for grabs in a legal dispute. There will be some arguments that the parties just agree. They will agree certain facts. They will agree certain things do or do not apply. They might accept certain kinds of liability. So again, this is just reflecting the complexity of the reality of the court system. So again, it's a way to introduce that notion that some arguments might be settled arguments. And the grey card here, this is a distinction card. Now, what that has said is that within this judgment created by this player using the cards they have been dealt, that judgment has said some of the authorities it's relying upon apply differently in this context than they have in previous contexts. That's a really important legal skill, to be able to say, right, the lawyer in front of me has argued that this particular case, Smith or whatever it is, applies to this dispute. Either as a judge or as the opposing lawyer, I need to think of a way to understand if it does. If I'm the opposing lawyer, it's in my interest to demonstrate that it doesn't apply. How do I do that? And if I am the judge, it's my role to determine if the case does or does not apply, or whether it can be distinguished from other cases with similar facts. And this is an early concept in legal reasoning that we look at. There's loads of different rules to it, but fundamentally, that is the point. And so by having this as the starting point, hopefully it's a way of kind of visually representing on a more conceptual level and getting into that idea without having to do what we traditionally do, which is to say, when we're distinguishing, there are 3 Latin rules that you must understand. That can very quickly put students off, that can very quickly get lost in the detail, whereas this is just another way of exploring that. So that's the game of Judge that's, as I said, co-created by myself and my colleague, Tom Giddens. And in terms of where it is being used, it was recently used by Tom at the University of Dundee amongst some third-year students. And that was received very well. He actually used it in his legal theory seminars. So he used that to demonstrate all manner of different things about the way that the law works. It's also previously been used at my old institution, Royal Holloway, and before that at Tom's old institution, St Mary's University in Twickenham. In terms of being used here at Exeter, it's something that I've not had a chance to directly use in class with my students yet, although I do plan to. But it's something that we have been using at board game nights with our law students to try and get their views on it. And that's really kind of that game. And hopefully, through that, you've seen how some of those inclusivity principles, which are embedded within game-based learning theory, as I understand it, have been played out here in the creation of a particular game. And so, oh, there you go. I missed out one other card. I may as well just explain what that is. That says practical expertise. This is kind of the common sense card, right? This is the idea that a judgment may be easier to apply and understand if there is that element of practicality to it. And that's something, again, we would talk about in students in terms of legal problem solving. But before I got distracted there by that final card popping up unexpectedly, that really is all I want to say. I hope that you found that interesting. And if you didn't, I hope you found it short. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about game-based learning, about this game itself, or anything that I have said today. But yeah, there you go. I'll stop sharing.